Hello everybody, Dokkan Assets here. Today we are back with another Dragon Ball figure video, and finally we are going to take a look at the top 5 worst figures of 2022. I am so excited to get into this video. I've been looking forward to doing this one. I hope you guys enjoy it. I know that a lot of you have been looking forward to it. I love doing these videos at the start of the new year, the end of the old one, whichever one you technically want to call it. So let's go ahead and hop right into it. Before we do though, let's go over our rules. Very simple rules, nothing too crazy here, but I feel like I need to explain them a little bit just so that you understand where I'm coming from on these. Rule number 1 is that I need to actually own the figure. Personally, I feel it's unfair to judge a figure based only on the images. Obviously, somebody can take as many images of a figure as they want, be it the production images or the IRL images or in the fans' hands, right? People who are actually buying the figures, the consumers. But when it comes to that sort of thing, obviously that's not me physically holding the object in my hand. And I know even when I've seen images of people holding them in hand and I have gotten them myself, I felt a little bit differently about them than I felt in the pictures sometimes. So personally, I feel like I need to own the figure to give it my perfect, seal of approval, or in this case, disapproval, right? Now, that being said, number 2 is that the honorable mentions in this video will be figures I either don't own or will never buy. Obviously, this one is more the case for this video, the worst video, where, of course, I'm not going to go out of my way to buy bad figures, right? Of course, sometimes figures end up on this list because either they weren't what I expected, or they have some defects when I get them, or they're just of poor quality, whatever the case may be. So, these figures that obviously I am not going to buy, and of course I am going to be judging from said images, I'm not going to be ranking in any order, and instead I'll just be talking about them in the honorable mention since, I wouldn't be buying the figures anyway. So, with all that being said, let's go ahead and get into our honorable mentions. Now, there are a ton of figures that I could honestly put in this list, to be honest with you, which is kind of an unfortunate thing to say. Don't get me wrong, we did get a lot of great Dragon Ball figures this year, but we also did get a lot of stinky Dragon Ball figures as well. So, we're kind of going to talk about these in, ironically enough, almost like 4 categories. That wasn't really what I intended to do here, but it just kind of became the case as I was looking through my honorable mentions. So we're going to talk about these guys in order of basically unnecessary figures, as well as just kind of bad quality overall with all of these, right? We're going to talk about lean, which you'll understand what I mean by that in a minute. We're going to talk about ugly, and then we're going to talk about quality control, which again, I think is still an issue that persists with all of these, but in a more specific way towards the end. So in terms of our unnecessary figures, right, starting us off, we have the Burning Fighters, Goku and Vegeta. Now, this line right here, I don't think is as bad as really any of the figures that I'm about to talk about, even in the honorable mentions, right? I will say Goku's quality, right, looking at him in the original production images and then especially in the finals, he really did not turn out that good. He's certainly not the ugliest Goku figure that I've ever seen, but he is still, he's pretty bad if I'm being honest. And the Vegeta didn't turn out too terribly. I still think that there's something with him that I kind of don't really like. I can't quite put my finger on it what it is with him, but he just looks a little bit too off in my opinion. However, with this line, besides the figures just not looking too great, which sort of adds to the unnecessity of this line just didn't really need to exist, right? We have so many Super Saiyan Goku figures. We have so many base form Vegeta figures. This line was supposed to be a sort of introduction line to new collectors for people to be able to get the main staple characters from the series. But the problem with that is that there's not really a ton of people who are new collectors, I guess. A lot of people who collect Dragon Ball figures have been doing it for a while. I know that's weird to say because obviously everybody needs to get into it at some point, but There's so many better options for these particular characters that already exist out there and aren't even too hard to find that you would probably just never buy these anyway. And it's no wonder that this line didn't really make it very far. So clearly these figures were not selling. Next up, we're going to talk about some figures that lean. That's right. Oh boy, my favorite. To start us off, we're going to talk about the Solid Edgeworks Vegeta and Vegito. Now, to be honest with you, the original production images for these looked pretty promising. They're not necessarily the most spectacular figures that I've ever seen, but they honestly do look pretty cool from these original images. And then the final product, they lean like crazy. Yup, that's right. These figures are the Leaning Tower of Pisa of Banpresto figures. Yuck! This is terrible quality control, if I do say so myself. How do you even end up making a figure like this and looking at it and going, yeah, that's okay to sell? And it doesn't help that Vegeta and Vegito really didn't turn out looking the greatest either in terms of their actual sculpts, especially their faces. And unfortunately, this whole leaning debacle was quite prevalent. Well, I mean, is sort of prevalent within the last couple years, but was prevalent specifically this year again with the DXF Gamma 1 and 2. Very unfortunate because the original production images for these guys looked pretty great, and then the final versions leaned like crazy, which is really unfortunate because obviously these are such a cheaper alternative to basically all of the other Gamma figures that we have, maybe besides the Dragon Stars line, right? The Ichiban Kuji ones are obviously more expensive than these guys, and of course the SH Figuarts ones are going to be more expensive than these guys. So it is really unfortunate that these guys turned out these way. I almost considered buying them myself, because obviously I'm so excited about Superhero and literally buying anything that I can get my hands on from the movie. But as soon as I saw that with the official images coming in from some of the arcades in Japan, that obviously are the places where you would go in Japan to get these prize figures from, you know, Crane Games and whatnot. Yeah, I was a little bit saddened, to say the least. Next up, we have our batch of ugly figures. I don't know why so many figures just turned out so ugly, and I think you could maybe even consider some of the ones we've talked about up until this point kind of ugly. But in my opinion, these other ones didn't really have many other problems besides the fact that they just didn't look that good. Starting us off, we have the Clear Eyes Super Vegeta. This line is really hit or miss. Sometimes they make really nice looking figures, and sometimes they make figures that look like this. I think the glaring issue here is obviously Vegeta's face. It's something. The shape of his face almost reminds me one of those like shapes that you would measure angles with in elementary school. It just does not look great. Not to mention his nose is super tiny for some reason. Looking at this thing from all angles, it just does not look correct. And as well, for a Super Vegeta figure, his body is nowhere near buff enough. Obviously, the whole point of the quote-unquote super form, right, of Super Saiyan, right, obviously like Super Trunks, you know, Super Goku, I don't think they ever call him that, but obviously the scene in the hyperbolic time chamber, right, and of course Super Vegeta in this case, they're supposed to be ridiculously buff, and that is not the case here, so kind of a strange decision on that one. Another ugly figure, unfortunately a relative of Vegeta, Trunks is also going to appear a little bit later in this too, which is kind of funny, is the Retsuden Trunks. We're talking about both of these bad boys, the Super Saiyan 1 and the base form one. From the get-go, I really didn't think that these figures looked that great from the original production images. Not only is the pose just kind of awkward, it's not the worst pose I've ever seen, but it's still kind of like, what is this supposed to be, right? I feel like there's definitely some tweaks that they could make to make it a little bit better. But just in general, Trunks' hair did not look that great on the Super Saiyan 1. Basically just looked like a bunch of bananas stuck to his head, right? Even his bangs didn't really look the greatest. And the base form one, ooh, yeah, the hair just does not look correct. Obviously, this is them trying to kind of go for the thing where, of course, because his hair is sort of parted down from the middle, from the scalp, when his hair would fly up, because he's kind of has it like buzzed on the sides, I guess, and his hair sort of goes over his head, it would be flapping up like this in the wind, but it just doesn't look great. And on top of that, the faces on both of these also are just not the greatest. And for my money, I'm going to say that the base form one is worse. These final images are arguably worse. I think it's just like the same problem, just presented in a different way from the original production images. I think the original production images looked a little bit better, but I still don't think that they looked great regardless, right? I think that this figure is just not great any way that you spin it. Another figure from the Cell Saga. Man, why did the Cell Saga get so shafted? I'm coming to realize that every figure in this ugly section is from the Cell Saga. We had the Masterlized Imperfect Cell. I was actually looking forward to this guy because, funny enough, my favorite form of Cell is actually Imperfect Cell. I know that's kind of a funny choice because obviously, like, why would it not be Perfect Cell? But I don't know. I just like the sort of monster-esque aesthetic of Imperfect Cell. I think it's really cool. And it's unfortunate that one of the first Imperfect Cell figures we've gotten in a while, I suppose, besides the SH Figuarts one, is this guy. Not only is this pose just so incredibly boring to look at, he's just basically standing there like, this is like the Grandista line, but just bad. It's just so unfortunate that he's literally just standing there. I would have much rather had some kind of dynamic pose for him, and he just doesn't look that good. The problem is, sometimes with making characters that are already ugly in their design on purpose, and I'm not saying that it's an ugly design, right? Like, it's not a bad design. It's ugly because it's supposed to make you go, ew, you know, type of thing, right? It's like when you look at the Xenomorphs or something like that, right? Or I guess one of Frieza's forms, you know, also applies to that. You kind of go, ooh, that's a little yucky looking, right? And that's kind of the point of Imperfect Cell. He's supposed to be this sort of disgusting creature, but this figure just looks disgusting, and not in the good way, right? It just doesn't look that great. His face is a little bit too small, right? His body looks very gangly and long. Not to mention, I'm not sure if I can actually find a picture of this, but the figure actually needs a stand to stand up with his tail because the tail is so heavy on the back. He actually needs a little cradle for it to even be able to stand, which is like, at that point, just incorporate the tail better into the figure. Like, I don't necessarily mind when they do that, and especially for certain figures where like the design just needs a support, right? Then sure, I understand. And especially when a figure is on a platform stand, right? I'm more akin to the prize figures. That makes sense. But for an Ichiban Kuji figure, that ain't it. And it is a little bit deceptive marketing that they show this guy without that little stand, because then you think, oh, well, he doesn't need anything to stand up besides himself. But nope, you have this little tail cradle, which is kind of funny because other figures like the Krillin, right, the GX Materia Krillin, he had a stand in the original images. So it's like, why would you not just show it there? I don't know. Just kind of a confusing thing to me. And to end off our ugly journey here, we're going to talk about both of these guys at once, because realistically, it's their faces that really do it for me, or I guess not in this case. The Ichiban Kuji Yardrat Goku and the Ichiban Kuji Trunks. Both of these guys from the same Ichiban Kuji, and actually from the same Kuji as the base form Yardrat Goku that I took a look at towards the end of the year. I think you can tell why I'm not a fan of either of these figures, right? I don't even think that the bodies look necessarily that bad, right? I think Goku's is a little bit better than Trunks's in terms of the body, but man, both of these faces are so bad. They are just an absolute disgrace to these characters. These figures look like bootlegs, right? Like, the face of both of these, absolutely, to me, just screams bootleg, right? Goku's face also being, or I guess I should say his head, also being like tilted to the side like that, where that's the figure all the way pressed down. And trust me, I've looked on the final images of this guy that I've seen from people who actually have him in hand. The head is just tilted like that, which is a telltale sign that a figure is a bootleg when it has something off center like that in the sculpt. But that's the official figure. Why it turned out like that, I don't know. And with Trunks, he just, I can't even describe how ugly my man is. That is only a face that a mother could love. Sorry, Bulma. These guys are just so unfortunate, and I think the overarching theme with all of this, right, is that it's such a shame that these figures cost so much and this is the quality that you end up getting for them. Speaking of which, let's talk about a little bit of overall poor quality that we have gotten for this year. A lot of figures this year have had some really poor quality control, whether it be scratches or misplacements of paint or just overall poor quality. I think for me, the Ichiban Kuji set this year that really stood that out in my mind was the Androids Ichiban Kuji. This was one that a lot of people were looking forward to because we don't really get figures of these characters too incredibly often, all of the androids. Especially not, right, like the characters who aren't 16, 17, and 18, right? Dr. Gero and Android 19, right? Those guys never ever basically get figures, right? So it was pretty cool that some of these Dragon Ball characters that weren't going to be, you know, getting figures that often were finally getting a chance to shine, and the quality control on a lot of them was just very poor. And not to mention, one other thing that I think is something that I've been seeing a lot more with Ichiban Kuji lately that I don't know if I just didn't notice it before, or if this is something more new that they're doing in the stinky department, but the scaling of the figures is incredibly off, and that's so weird because you would think that for these figures, at least for the set that they're in, right, the Ichiban Kuji set that they're all a part of, they would all be scaled properly to each other. Obviously, I understand if a character is not scaled correctly to another Ichiban Kuji figure from a different set, because of course that's not the point, right? But with characters from the same set, you would think that they would be scaled properly. And boy, oh boy, Android 16 and Android 17 and 18 are definitely not properly scaled. Obviously, if you take a look at some actual art from the manga or the anime, you can see that these figures definitely do not line up height-wise. So this set was just an example of this, to be honest. This was kind of happening all year this year, where a lot of these Ichiban Kuji sets just have poor quality control. And obviously, the scaling is just a bit of an unfortunate thing. I know it's not a big deal for a lot of people, right? Like, some people could definitely live with or without it, which I completely understand. But I know for me, like, obviously half of the time when I'm buying these, I'm looking for anime accuracy, or at least just for the figure to look good. And for me personally, right, I would much prefer it to be as close to the original source material as possible. So it's just kind of more of an unfortunate thing for me rather than a deal breaker. But the quality control, that is something that I am absolutely not happy with, especially considering the fact that Ichiban Kuji figure prices have been going up and up and up throughout the years, and the quality seemingly has been going down. I used to say that it was just the same, but seemingly with the quality control, it has just been going down over time, which is really unfortunate to see. Alright, that about wraps it up for our honorable mentions. Let's go ahead and get into the figures that I took a look at this year, our top 5 worst of 2022. To start off our list at number 5, we have the Ichiban Kuji Gamma 1 and 2. Now, I know what you're probably thinking here, ladies and gentlemen. What? Yeah, I would be reacting the same way. You're probably thinking, wait a minute, you praise these figures a lot in your video. You really like these figures. What's going on here? And yes, all of those things are true. Keep in mind, because of the rules of this video, the fact that the figures that are actually in my list I have to own means that some of the figures towards the bottom end of especially the worst list are going to be things that I was more disappointed in rather than actually bad figures, because of course I don't go out of my way to purposely buy bad figures, right? More often than not, when it comes to the figures that end up on these lists, I buy them, and then when I open them out of the box, something about them disappoints me. And the one problem that I have with these two, because I really, really like these figures, and I really do, and honestly, they could be contenders for the best list. There was a lot of good figures this year, if I'm being honest with you. But the thing that really bothers me the most about these guys is the fact that their sculpt is the exact same with the arm pose especially. I talked about this in the initial unboxing video, and I feel like these figures would have been perfect. Like, they are so close to being the Gamma 1 and 2 figures of my dreams, but if they would have adjusted the arms, that's
all I wanted, right? That's literally all they could have fixed, and these guys would not be here right now. They would not be at the bottom of this list here at number 5. It's such a simple thing that they literally could have just taken Gamma 1 or 2, right? Probably Gamma 1, and then made his other arm, you know, rest on his waist, and then have the other one droop so you could have the 1 and 2 next to each other, right? And have it flow a little bit better, because as it stands right now, with them both next to each other on the shelf, it doesn't look terrible, but it's just kind of a weird setup that both of them are in the exact same pose like this. And in the movie, they don't have the same personality. They may look exactly the same, minus obviously the color and the 1 and 2 on the chest, and of course the fins on their head. But they are not the same personality, so it would have been nice to have a figure that would have more reflected that. And obviously just changing the pose of the arm doesn't necessarily do that, but you understand what I'm getting at here. It would have been nice that instead of Bandai being lazy and literally just repainting the same sculpt and adding on an extra fin, they actually would have just changed the arms so these two, when posed next to each other, would actually look a little bit more coherent. Coming in at the number 4 slot, we have the Ichiban Kuji regular form, or base form, I guess you would call him, Cooler. Now I know what you're probably thinking, huh? I think you like this figure, don't you? And I do. I do indeed like this figure quite a bit, actually. I think it is a pretty good and very cool, no pun intended, representation of Cooler. And honestly, this figure may even be able to be swapped with the number 3 slot, if I'm being honest with you. But I think the reason why this guy is a little bit less worse than the other one, and I'll go over why the other one is worse when we get to that figure, but is because there isn't really a problem with me for the sculpt of this figure. I think his face maybe could be a little bit better for sure. It could definitely be a little bit closer to the original, but it doesn't look bad in my opinion. And the reason why this guy is down here at number 4 is because of 2 reasons really. For one, the figure looks kind of cheap and feels kind of cheap. When it comes to the material that they used on the actual figure, right? It's this weird sort of like, not sticky, but I mean a little bit. It just feels like it's one of those kind of bootleg figure materials, even though the figure itself looks fine. And as well, the very weird like shiny look on his skin is also something that I see on a lot of bootleg figures. It just doesn't feel as high quality as an Ichiban Kuji figure should. And in 2 different ways, right? I was disappointed with this figure because, for one, with the original Ichiban Kuji Cooler, of course, this being a very tall figure here, the Masterlize Extra Final Form Cooler, I really, really like this figure, and this is one of my favorite figures of all time, and I think that this guy should sort of be the standard for Cooler figures. What's ironic is that I actually like the shiny bits on the base form Cooler more than I do on the Final Form one. However, the sculpt on the Final Form one is so much better than the sculpt on the base form one, and I understand that obviously the Ichiban Kujis aren't sculpted by the same person all the time, and they're not necessarily using the same materials for every single figure. I mean, obviously most figures are, but I think they probably understood that a lot of people really wanted this figure to have with this one, because obviously they're both Ichiban Kuji figures, so why wouldn't you get the same guy to sculpt it, or at least try and get it a little bit closer to the original? And that is something that I can excuse, to be honest with you, right? That's something that I feel like almost could be a null issue. But the thing of the matter is, for me, when it comes to the Final Form Cooler, his material is really good. The material that he's made out of, the way that he looks in terms of the actual quality of the figure, right? The sculpt doesn't even have to be the same for it to be a good quality figure, right? Like I was just talking about, I would have kind of preferred some of the sculpting detail from that original Cooler onto this one, right? But that doesn't have to be the case, because obviously not every figure is, you know, the same in that regard. And not every figure is made the same. But ironically enough, in saying that, this figure feels like a cheap toy compared to the Final Form one, which looks like a expensive high-end figure that you would buy. Just looking at them side by side, and again, looking at that shiny paint job, the sort of way that the paint is applied onto the figure, It's just a little bit disappointing that this guy kind of didn't come out a little bit more higher quality looking. Coming in at number 3, we have the Ichiban Kuji Yardrat Goku. Now, I'm sure most of you are really scratching your head at this one. Huh? This figure this high up on the worst list? And you just unboxed this guy too? No. There's no way. There has to be something that I'm missing here. Well, you are. It's not actually this figure that I have a problem with. It's this figure right here. Yes, that's right. Oh man, this face is so bad, dude. The face for the Yardrat Goku, that is technically supposed to be the regular face part and not the alternate face part, is so ugly in my opinion that it puts it over all of the complaints that I had about Cooler. I don't even have a problem with the body of this figure. The only thing I would say even in regards to that would be the stand, because it lifts the foot off the ground, which is kind of still like a nitpick because that's not the figure's fault, that's the stand's fault for not being sculpted properly and then lifting the foot off the ground. But with that in tandem with the face, and obviously more so focusing on the face, the figure feels kind of like a bootleg because of the expression, the look, the way that his face is made. It just doesn't... I mean, it looks like Goku. Okay, I was going to say it doesn't look like Goku, but it does look like Goku, but it still just looks like a bootleg face. This face looks like something that you would see on a figure on AliExpress. Like, it almost looks like I ordered this figure off of AliExpress and then took the head from the AliExpress one and put it on the body of the real figure with how bad the actual face sculpt on this figure looks. So I don't think that this figure is a bad figure by any means, but the face sculpt is just so ugly to me that obviously it's better than the sort of nitpick of the posing thing with the gammas and the, you know, overall quality of Cooler. I just think if a figure doesn't look good, right, then it's bad, right, for sure. So thank Kami that this guy comes with the glasses head, because that absolutely, for me, redeems this figure, right? Really, I suppose you could just say that the head is at number 3 here, to be honest with you. And on the note of this figure, I will say one other thing that is a bit of a nitpick for me, well, not supposedly, but I suppose, I guess I should say, is that the arm and the little like plug that they have for where his hand plugs into the glasses piece doesn't fit exactly correctly. This is kind of something that has been a common theme with a lot of Bandai's figures that they have released in the last couple years, especially since they absorbed Banpresto, where sometimes figures' legs are too wide to actually fit on the pegs on the base of a figure, or sometimes attachments are not sculpted correctly, or the hole is not sculpted correctly to allocate for where the accessory should be on the figure. And that is the case here. It is a very, very minor case of it, so I'm going to excuse it, but I figured it was still worth mentioning that was something that added into this. But really, it's the face. That's why this figure's at number 3. Coming in at the number 2 slot, this is where we really start to get into figures that are just straight up bad for the most part, right? This slot here is taken up by a sort of newcomer to the top 5 worst of the year, including SH Figuarts figures in this year's lineup of the best and worst, has brought us the number 2 slot of the SH Figuarts Premium Bandai Kefla. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. That's a little bit strange. I mean, I remember you having some complaints about the figure, but overall I remember you liking it, and I think that that is true. However, this figure has a lot of problems, and I mean a lot of problems. So let's go over them. For one, the price of the figure. I think that is something that you need to know from the get-go when I start talking about this, because with a bunch of the other figures on this list, sometimes it's hard to get the MSRP for these because different websites charge different prices for them, and I would kind of value them at different ranges. However, This figure comes straight to us from Premium Bandai, being a $60 figure. Now, of course, this figure is pretty tiny, and not to mention Kefla is just pretty small herself. So how do they justify the $60? Well, of course, they try and include all of these different effect parts and multiple different face pieces and all this different stuff to try and make it sort of worth the higher upcharge that they like to charge just because it's Premium Bandai, which I'm glad that at least if they're going to do that, they try and include some extra accessories. But I still don't think, even with the accessories that were included with this figure, it is worth that price. And not to mention with the problems that I have with the figure. For one, on my copy of the figure specifically, there was a really loose singular arm. For some reason, one of Kefla's arms was a lot looser than the other. Why only one and not both, I'm not exactly sure. And to be fair, this is definitely just a problem with my figure specifically, because I have not really heard of this being a super widespread issue, and sometimes people do get defects on their specific version of a figure. However, a figure that costs this much and is literally from a website called Premium Bandai should not be having problems like this, right? Where one peg is literally smaller than the other, because then the problem becomes it's hard to even use the figure and use as accessories, because since the one peg was smaller than the other, and again, the arm then by proxy becomes a lot looser, it's hard to use the extra accessories that they have with it because the figure either can't hold up the weight of it, or it can't hold the pose because the arm is just too loose, or the arm just completely falls out. And so, with that being said, obviously, that is just an issue that should not even be there. For two, some of Kefla's faceplates are not the greatest, if I'm being honest with you. I'm alright with the smirking face, I think. I think it could still even just be a little bit better, like basically her default face. But especially that shouting face, ugh, yucky. Just does not really look that great at all, in my opinion. Not to mention the forehead on my girl. Oh, bro, she got a cranium bigger than Megamind. It just doesn't really look that good, in my opinion, on the combination of the face sculpt just not being that great with the forehead being that massive. You could literally land a airliner on that thing. For a premium figure, again, it just doesn't really feel like it should look that bad and should kind of ignite these emotions in me. It should just look like the character. And it's kind of a shame because I feel like a lot of the recent SH Figuarts figures have done a really good job at capturing the character's likeness, but I really feel like they fumbled the bag with Kefla on that overall. And the final thing that I really had a big problem with this figure was the little way that they did her waist and her butt, because they basically gave her a diaper? I don't know why the figure is sculpted this way, but as you can see, she doesn't actually have this part connected to her body. It's just like a chunk of plastic that's kind of just hanging out, right? Like if you shake the figure, you know, you can see it moving around. Can you hear that in the mic? I don't know if you can actually hear that in the mic. Maybe you can, but that is this little part here just kind of schmoovin', shaking and moving. And not only does that look weird when you pose the figure and you can literally see, like, you know, this giant gap that is caused by this, surely they could have engineered this in a better way to just maybe have it been like a softer material, so then that way you can still move the legs accordingly and you could still get some decent articulation while also not having it basically just be a plastic diaper that's attached to her. And then because it's so hard too, you can't even give her legs really much like upward movement at all, right? Like that's as far as her leg goes unless you twist it like this, which obviously isn't really what you're going for, right? Obviously you end up wanting to, you know, kick it up, and she literally just can't kick up because of this hard plastic piece. And not to mention, because it is hard plastic, you can see that at least on my copy, the like back of her legs, I'm sorry, this is a very unflattering angle, but it's what I need to do to show you. You can see that my figure has kind of gotten a little bit of like, I don't want to call it dirt, I guess like scuffs would be the best way to describe it, on like her inner thighs there from kind of rubbing up against this hard piece of plastic there. It just seems like such a strange choice for this figure, if I'm being honest with you. But that is basically everything that I've got for you for Kefla. Again, overall, I still like this figure, and I mean, we literally have no Kefla figures besides this one, basically, so, you know, I'll take what I can get, but man, this figure got a lot of issues. And coming in at number 1, the worst figure of 2022 that I have opened this year and was released this year is the Super Dragon Ball Heroes Limit Breaker Super Saiyan 4 Vegeta. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, I am not sure if this one will be a surprise for some of you. Maybe it'll be a surprise considering how much I like Dragon Ball Heroes, but I actually decided to put this guy on the worst list, let alone number 1. But I'm sure for a lot of you who looked at that original video and thought, yuck, this figure is kind of not good, this one may be a little bit expected for you. It'll be interesting to see what you think in the comments about this one. But this figure is kind of an amalgamation of feelings for me, right? I really like Dragon Ball Heroes, and I really like Dragon Ball Heroes' unique form. So obviously, being able to get figures of these basically like Dragon Ball side story or side project, right? Like side timeline, whatever you want to call it thing. These non-canon figures is super cool that we even have the opportunity for that. However, with a lot of the Super Dragon Ball Heroes figures, they are heavily reused from other figures that we already have, and that is the case with your boy Vegeta here, obviously being reused from the greatest Saiyan Ichiban Kuji Vegeta. Now, that in and of itself is already a reason why it would be on the worst list, right? Obviously, figure reusing is terrible, not good. It's something that we in the figure community really dislike because it's something that only came upon when Bandai sort of gained the monopoly on the Dragon Ball figure brand. And not to mention, with other anime, they get figures that are definitely not reusing a lot more unique stuff, and Dragon Ball ends up getting 3 versions of the same Gogeta figure. It happens all the time, and it's just such a shame to see with the brand. And Dragon Ball Heroes, as unfortunate as it is, sort of epitomizes that fact. And coming back to the boy Vegeta here, collecting my thoughts, because I have a lot to say about this guy. It's sort of a culmination of the figure itself just looking very awkward, and the fact that it's not a reused, or the fact that it is rather a reused sculpt, I guess I should say, kind of makes it feel more awkward than it could if they just made this an original sculpt, because obviously what they were trying to do was base it off of the card art, but they said, oh, we have a Vegeta figure that's very similar, and we could use different pieces of it to just make the same thing again with a little bit of different posing, and then call it that it's based off of this card art, right? And it'll be a lot easier for us to make it that way. But in doing so, and kind of taking these different pieces and putting them together and changing it a little bit, it comes out with a figure that just feels very awkward to look at. Like, there is one good angle to look at this figure, and even that angle isn't necessarily the best one, right? He just looks very awkward in the pose that he has, right? I feel like his shoulders are almost like he has his shoulders hunched up a little bit, like he should almost just be kind of relaxing them a little bit more. Even the way that his arm is kind of posed up looks a little bit awkward. And I think the thing is too, like the direction that he's looking combined with the actual direction that his head is facing, and then combining that on top of the direction that your eyes sort of naturally flow because of the pose that he has for his arm that's up in the air, it's just all over the place, right? I could see if they had his eyes maybe more focused towards his hand with his head pointing in that direction, right? And again, I understand that it's taking it off of the card art, so it makes sense to me that it kind of feels a little bit awkward because obviously sometimes it's hard to get a 2D illustration into a 3D space, but because of the fact that the pose was already kind of a little bit weird, right, in terms of making it into 3D, and then the fact that they didn't just make an original figure and, you know, reused the other Super Saiyan 4 Vegeta, came out with this really awkward product where you just kind of don't know where to look at him, and the direction that he's looking just doesn't really fit the direction of where all of his different body parts are. It's just a very awkwardly posed figure. And so that is going to do it for the top 5 worst figures of 2022. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. All those funny YouTube things always help out the channel. Please let me know what you thought of my picks in the comments section below. I'm also very interested to hear what are your top 5 worst figures of the year. I really like doing it this way because obviously I could just pick the most obvious, you know, top 5 worst figures that were released this year, but not only for the fact that I feel like I can't truly judge a figure unless I own it. I think doing it this way always makes it a little bit more interesting and a little bit more unique, and you kind of maybe don't expect as much as some of the picks that I end up putting on my list if I just did all of those figures that are blatantly the worst, you know what I mean? But of course, if you did enjoy this video and you would like to see more content like this, I do have a Patreon specifically for this figure channel. All the proceeds from that Patreon will go directly into the figure unboxing channel, getting more figures for you to view. So I hope you enjoy, and of course, please look forward to next year's video because there are definitely going to be some good figures coming out next year, and we're already looking at some ones that may be on the list, baby. So I hope you enjoyed. Look forward to the best of the year. That one is going to be a very fun one, and I will see you then. Dokkan Assets out. Peace.